Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Welcome to the Wine Down, Pinkies Up Red Blend Tasting. Hopefully, many of you were able to pick up the wines today that we're going to taste through. You may have picked up one of our flyers in the store, and some of those flyers on the back side have a tasting mat on the back. And if you look at those tasting or that map, we're going to taste from left to right. You'll be able to ask questions as well, so please do so during the event. Excited now to introduce you to our host tonight, Group Vice President of Albertsons Companies. He oversees all the wine and beer and spirits in the company for the Albertsons Companies. His name's Curtis Mann. Who is he? He's a master of wine. A master of wine, what does that mean? All of us who have a glass every night after work think of ourselves as master of wines. I do myself. But what does it really mean to be a master of wine? To become a master of wine, it takes massive amounts of studying and knowledge in the world of wine. You have to pass an intense exam that is not just written, but you have blind tastings, theories, practical skills in art, science, and business of wine, and of course, a hefty, hefty research paper. Can anyone be a master of wine? Absolutely. But let me tell you, there's only just over 50 of them in the United States and over 406 in the entire world. So it's very, very difficult, but definitely something any of us can do. So I encourage you to do it. But without further ado, here we go. I'm going to turn it over to Curtis Mann, MW, Master of Wine.
Thanks, Chris. Hopefully you guys can see that my presentation. So what we're going to do today, we're going to go ahead and go through this red blends virtual tasting. We're going to talk about what red blends are, the grape varietals used in red blends, the characteristics of vineyards that typically red blends are grown in, winemaking techniques on red blends, how to taste red blends, and then we're going to taste 5 great red blends today. And then we're going to have a little time for questions. So what you're going to notice is that we've kind of changed the format a little bit on this. We're experimenting with different types of formats with Microsoft Teams. A lot of you do this for work, so you get to participate in Teams during the day. So this is the evening tasting version of Teams, and so we have put together this presentation, in Teams. And what we want you to do is you can ask questions through the chat. And then we will hopefully answer those questions as we go. Now, some of the questions I'll answer at the end, some I'll answer as we go, depending on where we are in the presentation. So anyway, without further adu, this is, kind of the schedule. And then the next, the wines that we're tasting today. So what you should do is have these wines hopefully with you. The Gigal Côte de Rhône, the Intrinsic Red Blend, the Bogle Essential Red, and the Josh Wine Legacy Red, and the Pessimist Red. And we're going to taste those at the end and kind of give you an idea of how those wines work, during the, kind of finishing up the presentation. Okay, so first thing that we're going to talk about is a red blend overview. So what is a red blend? Why are they called red blends? Well, originally red blends were wines that were, a blend of different varietals, and that's what became essentially the original red blend was Bordeaux. And Bordeaux was essentially a region where you had a number of different grape varietals that were used. And the reason that they used a number of different grape varietals is because every year, sometimes the weather conditions wouldn't allow for certain grape varietals to grow well enough. So they needed to have other grape varietals to blend together. And that's originally, the first kind of original red blend there. And there have been many different types of red blends. I mean, there have been red blends in Italy and Spain, but those were kind of the first version of a red blend. It's spread, this idea of a red blend, of a proprietary red or a Bordeaux style red, kind of spread to the New World. And so while we have the examples in the Old World, which is Spain, France, Italy, a lot of these new regions are, newer regions, I suppose, like Australia, California, South Africa, are making these proprietary red blends that are based off of other red blends around the world. It's actually become a very popular category. It's so red blends right now, we kind of separate out, the classical old world red blends like Bordeaux and Priorat, maybe those don't count here, but domestic and New World red blends actually make up 5.1% of the United States grocery category for wine sales. So it's a big category. And across all of the different grocery stores and and liquor stores across the country, there are 1,951 red blends that were in the system database. So there's a lot of people making red blends, which is pretty interesting. And then I mentioned that there's there's Bordeaux style red blends, there's Rhone style red blends, and then there's like kitchen sink red blends. So which means everything's mixed together, and it's kind of a different, it's a grouping of wines that maybe typically wouldn't be put together. So anyway, so here we go. So for some reason I can't switch the slides. There we go. So we're going to talk about what drives the taste of red blends. So what is it? Is it the grape? Is it the vineyard? Or is it the winemaking? And guess what? It's all three. So here we go. So what are the things, the major things that drive the flavors from the grape? And these are the major red blend wines. So there's actually more of them, but if I went through all of them, this would be a very tedious presentation. So I picked the major ones that are kind of the basics for most red blends. And so Grenache and Syrah are really the base, and Mourvedre, the GSM blend from from the Southern Rhone, which then also got translated into GSM blends from Australia and GSM blends from the Central Coast. You have Sangiovese, which is being used in Italy as a blending grape with Cabernet or Merlot in a super Tuscan style of blend. And then you have your classic Cabernet Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Bordeaux style blend, usually with Petit Verdot and Malbec kind of thrown in there, maybe as a couple more blenders. And then Zinfandel is often used as a blender too. So you're seeing Zinfandel as more in that like kitchen sink red blend situation, where you have Zinfandel as the base for the really fruity character, and then the rest of the wines kind of fill in the structure. And we're going to taste one of the wines today that has a decent amount of Zinfandel, and you're going to see how that affects the red blend character. How these grapes are kind of put together is what is the interesting part of the situation, right? So I put together this, like, I started putting together a Venn diagram, and then it kind of turned into a mess of a diagram. So you've got all these different types of wines. You have Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre together, like I said, the GSM, but oftentimes Syrah is then blended with Zinfandel. Sometimes Zinfandel is blended with Cabernet. On the other side, you have Sangiovese, which is sometimes blended with Cabernet and Merlot. And then you have Cabernet Franc, and Merlot together. So this is just a general overview of the red blends out there. But, in some cases, there could be even more combinations, so many combinations that this would have just turned into a mess. But if you're thinking about like probably 90% of the red blends, they fit in this realm here. And the reason is that a lot of these wines are complementary to each other, right? So these styles, we talked about, like the Syrah has a, intensity of tannins and a blue fruit character, where the Grenache is lighter in tannins but has a red fruit character. So they're a perfect combination together. The Syrah has a little bit more acidity, the Grenache has less acidity, and the Grenache provides more alcohol, and so you get this like really nice melding of the flavors. Cabernet, Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. Merlot is more broad, mid palate. Cabernet is more kind of front palate, a little more tannic. And the Cabernet Franc is more lifted in aromatics. So you get this combination of all these wines together, and that's when you get into the middle and you get that perfect, combination of those wines. And they're not always just blended, straight up, right? 33%, 33%, 33 or 34%, right? There oftentimes, it'll be a majority of a certain varietal and then added in kind of spice for the other ones. So that's kind of hopefully, a good overview of what you're seeing during this, when we're tasting through these wines. And there's a couple of the wines we're going to taste that kind of violate all these rules. So, that's going to be fun. So the vineyard. So we talked about the grape varietals. Now, how do we get to the vineyard? How does the vineyard influence what's going on with the grape varietals? So most red blends are produced in moderate to warmer climates. You don't see a tremendous amount of red blends that are low in alcohol. And I think that's because typically your lower alcohol reds, like a Pinot Noir or maybe a Gamay, or if you're thinking of a really lighter style single vineyard designate Syrah or single area Syrah. What you're going for in those wines is the complexity of aromas and the delicacy of the fruit. And so, there you're if you blend those wines out, then oftentimes you lose that kind of delicacy of aromas and authenticity of that vineyard site or the vineyard area. So typically you don't see those wines blended, but when you get to red blends, you're talking about bigger, bolder wines that you're molding together flavors to get more than the sum of its parts, right? So you want soil that helps you obtain some ripeness. And this is a good example. So this vineyard right here is in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and these big pudding stones that you can see here, they reflect the heat. So this Grenache gets even riper because it's very windy in the southern Rhone. So you can have situations where the ripeness doesn't come if you didn't have the pudding stones. The pudding stones reflect that heat, gain your ripeness in the Grenache. That really rounds out the Châteauneuf-du-Pape, makes it a bold wine. One thing you do need to have is almost in every case, you need to have some sort of well-draining soil. You've got these grape varietals. You're trying to create intensity of fruit. And if you have a vineyard that doesn't drain very well, then oftentimes the vines themselves grow too vigorous, and you don't get the intensity of fruit because the vine spends way too much time focusing on producing leaves and not enough time focused on producing grapes, so that you don't get that intensity of flavor. The other thing is that there's different soils for different types of wine. So I mentioned here, this is Grenache that we're talking about on this vineyard site with the pudding stones. You want a low moisture vineyard. Grenache is a little bit susceptible to rot and things of that sort. You have other grape varietals like Cabernet. We'll look at some of those vineyards that like more gravel, and then you have other vineyard sites or other varietals like Merlot that like more loam. And so what that does is that gives you the flexibility as a winemaker when you're saying, hey, I'm trying to make a wine, but I only have I have these different vineyard sites, and Cabernet maybe doesn't grow so well on here. So maybe I should plant Merlot, because Merlot is going to give me interesting flavors on clay, and the Cabernet is going to do better on the gravel. I mean, it's kind of what you're given as a winemaker, and so that can give you a really interesting wine that you can make from that combination. Whereas before, you might have just stuck making just Cabernet if you only wanted to plant on the gravelly soils. These are some of the regions, the classic regions of red blend production. And so, what we're seeing here is we have, regions like Bordeaux that I mentioned, Southern Rhone, Tuscany, Valpolicella, Rioja, Priorat, Languedoc, Douro. Okay, so real quickly, just so we don't spend hours talking about this, because I know everyone's dying to get to the tasting. These regions like Bordeaux, they sit in the kind of southwest part of France. They're that maritime climate. They can get somewhat warm. They're the examples for the rest of the world. So Southern Rhone, we talked about that. Tuscany. Valpolicella is a region in Italy that has a combination of Italian grape varietals like Corvina, Rondinella, and then Rioja is a region in Spain that has based on the Tempranillo grape, but it also has some other varietals that are put into it. And then Priorat, which is a kind of a interesting up and coming area in Spain, is a blend of you get Carignan and sometimes Syrah and Grenache there. And then the Languedoc is kind of like the Central Valley of from California of France, where there's a lot of different blends there, mainly often based on Grenache and Carignan. And then the Douro, where you have like one of the original red blends, which was port, where you have Tinto Roriz and Touriga Nacional blended in, but they're making a lot of just regular reds. And then others, I mean, I didn't like put a picture of the whole world, but a lot of these wines are then emulated other places. So it's kind of fun to explore the red blends. And if it comes all down to it, in a lot of cases, these regions like Bordeaux or the Rhone or Tuscany, they're named after the region. They're actually not named after the grape varietals. So you have to think through the process. Oh, wait, so it says, this wine says Toscana IGT. Well, that means it's a red blend from Tuscany. Or it says Côte de Rhône. Well, that's a red blend from the Southern Rhone. Or Douro it's a blend from, grape varietals in the Douro region of Portugal. Okay. So let's see. I'm trying to change the page here. Okay. So here's a couple vineyard sites. If you were wondering about like what gravel looks like in the soil, here in Bordeaux, you have this very gravelly soil. These kind of light stones. This is specifically in Pauillac, which is one of the most famous areas. It's where Chateau Latour is and Chateau Mouton, Rothschild. This vineyard site, I think this is Lynchbage. What happens is you have these running areas through Bordeaux of gravel that kind of, as they drain the Bordeaux swamp in the late 1700s, they had these whole areas of gravel that were kind of surrounded by areas of clay and loam. So hence the reason in the clay and the loam, you plant the Merlot, and in the gravel, you plant the Cabernet. And they basically found that out over years. Wait, if I plant Cabernet in the clay, it's not that super interesting. It just kind of is insipid wine. And if I plant Merlot in the gravel, it doesn't really get ripe. So I'm gonna mix those two and get these amazing wines. So that's a great example of Bordeaux vineyards. Rhone, we talked about that already with the pudding stones. Here's an even better example of pudding stones, these huge, big stones that reflect the heat. Again, this is old vine Grenache. You can see these vines are close to the ground. This is taken, of course, this picture is taken in the I believe in early March is when I took this picture, before bud break or any of that. So you get a good example of what the soil looks like. And then here's a Nap Valley vineyard. This, I believe, was this is one of the Stagecoach vineyards within the Stagecoach, a 600-acre vineyard. You can see the kind of the reddish soil. It's a very thin soil built on volcanic soil. Cabernet is mainly planted up here, but there's actually some quite good Malbec and Petit Verdot that do well on this volcanic soil. Not classically like, hey, it's not gravelly, it's not clay, it's actually volcanic. But what it does is it's pretty poor soil, and the Cabernet, which is a vigorous grape varietal, really on this type of soil focuses its attention on production of high quality grapes. And so you get this really nice little wine from that vineyard specifically. Okay, we're going to talk about the winery now. So we've talked about the grape varietals and what they provide, the vineyard sites and what they provide, and then what are the wines in the or sorry, how do the wines influenced by the actual winemaking? And so again, for those of you who've attended these virtual tastings before, it is really hard to find good quality descriptors of the winemaking process in visual form. I think it's because it's so complicated. So the best thing I have here, thank you to Co-Brand. They allowed us to use this. This is the best that I have right now. So one day when I draw my own winemaking process, and maybe I'll be able to present it a little bit more functionally for you. But here's what we got from Co-Brand, which is really nice for them to share it. So, the red winemaking process, again, it's about fermentation. Taking the grapes themselves, putting them into the tank, putting them into the press, pressing the wines out of the press, and then fermenting the wines. And you ferment generally on the skins. In fact, all red wine is really made on the skins because that's where the color comes from. If you just fermented red wine without the skins, you wouldn't have any color at all. So the other thing typically, you have the kind of the varietal itself, you have the fermentation process, and then you have kind of the pressing, and then how long do you leave it on the skins before you send it to the barrel? Now, every wine is different, so we could spend. I'm looking at the time here. I mean, I've already gone about 20 minutes on this, so I could spend another 3 hours talking about how these alt wines are made. But I want to say a couple of key differences in the way that red blends are made. So first off, usually the varietals are made separately. So you would make a Grenache in one tank, and you'd make a Syrah in another tank. They're generally not blended together. They usually wait until they're in a barrel or they're in a tank, and they've waited for 9 to 12 months, and then they're blended together. And the reason is because the wines are different, right? Like, so Syrah is a very what they call reducted varietal. So if you make that wine in the same way you make Grenache, which is an oxidative varietal, then you're going to get this wine that's going to be really they throw off a lot of strange esters. And at the same time, if you make the Grenache in the like in a very oxidative style, then you get this wine that's going to be oxidated because it's already an oxidative grape varietal. So you have to be careful how you're making each wine. You know, Cabernet versus Merlot is a good example. You might beat the Cabernet up a little bit more, as in you might, you know, do extra grape extraction. You might not do that with the Merlot because you might end up with a wine that's, you know, not as interesting or might be missing some of its, you know, elegance and delicacy. So, and we're going to taste a wine today that's going to give us a good example of an extended maceration of skins. So, very interesting, you know, part of that, and it's going to help us talk about the winemaking process. The other parts of this is the, you know, how long are you going to age the wine? So, you know, there's a lot of different options as far as red blends go. Typically, red blends are aged in oak. And the reason is that most of these red blends are big and bold and they have a lot of tannins. And so you want to round those tannins, the biting character of the wine. If you don't age it in oak and you just leave it in tank, you're going to end up with this very aggressive tannin characteristic. And I've actually had some of those wines, you know, generally they're less expensive. You know, because oak is expensive, right? So they're made in stainless steel, and it's always a challenge to really get those right. So generally they're put in oak, and then the question too is like, okay, what type of oak? Is it American oak? Is it French oak? Is it, you know, there's all sorts of people now aging in maybe not in oak, but in amphora, which is then, you know, similar to oak, but doesn't impart any oak flavor. And so, you know, all the rest of all the rest of the, you know, kind of decisions that you have to make. And the question then is like, you know, how do you then blend all these characteristics together to make the perfect wine? And then, of course, you bottle all of this at the end. So when we get to the tasting here, this is kind of my red blend wheel that I put together. So, you know, we've learned about the things that are affecting red blends. I think the styles of red blends, you really have a red blend, a Rhone style, Bordeaux style, Tuscan style, and a kitchen sink style. So those are really the main ones. And we're going to taste a Rhone style, a Bordeaux style, and a kitchen sink style today. We have kind of on the right, on the red side, is all the things that I think of when I think of red blends. Am I thinking of these, you know, dried cherries, red cherries, you know, chocolate, pepper, all these varietal aromas that come from the grapes themselves? Are there characters that are coming from the vineyard? So there are sometimes, you know, sorry, I'm getting a note. So this is a good time if you want to ask questions in the chat, please do, because we do have we're going to get to the wines here in a sec, and we're at the end of this part. So if there's anything comes up, just ask in the chat if you have a question. So anyway, so basically, those four the vineyard characteristics, you know, kind of add to the wine, to the quality. And those are typically, you know, as I mentioned, baking spice, herbs, graphite, eucalyptus. And then you have the winemaking characteristics, which also include, you know, some of these other things like chocolate, vanilla, and the tannins. So, you know, those are, I think, a kind of a key piece to when you're looking at the wines. That's how you're going to analyze them. Use these pieces here. So far as I know right now, I don't see any questions. I just wanted to check before we get too far in here. Okay, so on to the wines. So hopefully you have all of our beautiful wines that we're going to taste today. The first wine being the Guigal Côte de Rhône. So Guigal is a very famous winery. They are one of the major producers in the Rhone, and they make some very, very high quality wines that are, you know, upwards of $400 or $500. But the wine that they're actually the most proud of is this Côte de Rhône, and the reason being is that this wine is typically you know, really high quality, and that's not typically, it is very high quality every year, even though it sells for around $16. So it's an interesting wine, and I think it's a great wine for you to introduce yourself to France if you're interested in learning about like the Côte d'Aron wines, but you don't necessarily have $50 or $60 to pay for Chateauneuf du Pape, which a lot of us, we just don't go out and buy $50 or $60 bottles of Chateauneuf du Pape. So this is a great alternative. It's a blend of Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvedre, which is pretty typical for the region. However, it's a little bit more on the Syrah side. So in the Côte d'Aron, the Grenache grape is a little bit more dominant than Syrah. So this one, in this case, Syrah is a little bit more dominant than Grenache, which is somewhat unusual. But it's made in kind of the classical way. There's a long maceration on the grapes, which means that it stays on the skins past fermentation, but not for like a really long time, just for a week or two. And then what they do is they age this wine in older oak for 24 to 30 months. So a lot of the wines, like there's still the 17 and the 18 is coming out on the shelf. And so that's why this wine is actually a couple vintages older than some of the other wines we're going to taste. It's not that the wine is old, it's that they age the wine a long time in older oak. And they do that to round the tannins out because it is a pretty tannic wine. They've given a descriptor here of a rich, juicy mouthfeel, expressive flavors of blueberry and blackberry. I just think it has that classic Southern Rhone character, brambly, definitely some blueberry and blackberry fruits. There's also a touch of I would say tar and spice in a good way. It's not a bad thing, right? There's just this really nice spicy character to the wine. And then there's, aromatically on the nose, I would say that there's some sort of flower, like almost a lavender or whatnot, or rose petal, which makes it really a very pretty wine. I put this in the tasting because honestly, for $17 or whatever we sell it for, I mean, it varies from 17 to 20 to $23 depending on where it is, where it had to be shipped to around the country. But it's just a beautiful wine for that price point. And I think that this is a classic because of the that acidic, or sorry, the acidity. It's not acidic, but the acidity. This is a really good wine with the roasted meats because it takes that kind of that fattiness in the roasted meat and it elevates it. And so I would really eat this with the roasted meat. There was a good question from our red blends ever made in stainless steel. And so we talked a little bit about the tank method or aging wines in stainless steel. This says made, so this question is made in stainless steel. So in this case, like this Côte d'Aron you would say it's made in stainless steel because it was fermented in stainless steel. And the reason why it's fermented in stainless steel is because they have to make a lot of this wine. It's not a small production wine, so it's much more efficient to make it in stainless steel. If they have to make it in small oak barrels or even in Foudre, which is a little bit larger, they just wouldn't be able to make this wine. It wouldn't be financially possible to make this wine. But the great news with stainless steel is that you can temperature control it. And so a lot of great wines across the world are made in stainless steel. More and more people are moving to oak on the really expensive wines, but this case, that's that. As far as aging goes, again, I think we talked earlier about you could age some wines in stainless steel. And one of the wines we're going to taste, I believe, was aged in stainless steel for a while for a reason. But in general, like I said, the oak is where the wines are aged because stainless steel is an inert vessel, and it's really hard to kind of restrain the tannins when the wine doesn't go through a process of slow oxidation. There are a couple of new techniques that are helping people age some of these wines more in stainless steel and not use as much oak. And the technique of micro-oxygenation, where you can bubble in little bubbles of oxygen into the wine, and you can take like oak chips and oak staves and put them in the wine and help introduce oxygen that way. But usually it's a component of then aging the wine it's some of the wine, at least in oak too, because you can't get all the way there with micro-oxygenation. But it is a fascinating kind of idea. There's another question about and it's actually a great question. So this question is about bourbon barrel aged wines and all. So you're right. I did not cover the bourbon barrel aged wines. Now, one of the reasons I didn't was that most of the bourbon barrel aged wines are specific to a grape varietal, but I guess there's no reason why there couldn't be bourbon barrel aged red blend, and there probably are a couple out there, just maybe I just don't know them yet. So bourbon barrels introduce a significant amount of flavor into the wine, right? Because that bourbon that was in the barrel eventually, I mean, I want to say leaches in is not the really the right term, but it does, right? That flavor kind of ends up in the wine. And so, typically what I find the ones that I like the most for the bourbon barrel ones are the ones that are like Zinfandel, where you have a really fruity, raspberry characteristic, and then that kind of bourbon American oak, almost bourbon character slips into the wine. And so I don't see as many red blends because I think then the flavor gets pretty muddled. But that's a great question. So yeah, so as far as when we're aging things in different types of vessels, that bourbon barrels are definitely an option. So that's a great question. So keep them coming. Those are some nice ones. Okay, so we have that wine, the Gigal. Now we're going to go to Washington State. So I put this in the tasting because I think it's just absolutely fascinating wine. First off, the label is won like a gazillion different awards. So it's one of the prettiest bottles on the shelf. But what it is it's intrinsic red blend. It comes from the Columbia Valley, which is kind of the core valley. It's not kind of. It is the core valley of Washington. But one of the reasons, or one of the more specific pieces about this wine, is that most of this wine comes from Horse Heaven Hills, which, if you can see in the presentation, is near the bottom. It's right on the river between Oregon and Washington. And so while I think this is designated as Columbia Valley, it is, but it's mostly from Horse Heaven Hills. I think that just gives them flexibility if they, for some reason, need to change the grape sourcing. So here's a kind of an odd one. I mean, it's got two components of the Bordeaux wine. It's got Cabernet Franc and Malbec. So interesting combination. And the one thing about, I mean, the very unique thing about this wine is that um, it's made in an extended maceration style. So the reason I put this in this tasting was that the wine is fermented in stainless steel and concrete, and then 50% of the wine stays on the skins for 9 months. So that's a very unusual thing. Most wine, it stays on the skin during fermentation, and then once fermentation is complete, once you get to 14% alcohol, then, or 15% or whatever it is, and then the skins are taken off and they're composted. This wine, they take a half of the production and they leave it on the skins for 9 months. And we're like, well, why would you do that? Because wouldn't you get to a point where the wine sat on the skin so much that it took at least so many tannins out of the wine that the wine becomes so tannic and undrinkable? Well, it's interesting. There's more and more research going on with this, where actually the longer that the wine stays on the tannins, then sometimes the tannins bind more and then fall out. So you get different characters. So I thought this was a really interesting wine for that reason. It's basically an extended maceration wine, and so they leave some of this wine in stainless steel and concrete, and actually age it there. So that's a good question. The last one is a wine made in stainless, and then the others made in oak. And then it's combined back together. And I just thought this is, to me, it's always a very interesting wine. Juan Munoz Oca, who's the winemaker there, is a fabulous winemaker, and he's kind of, he's basically, he saw some similar extended maceration going in Bordeaux, and he's like, well, what if we go further? What if we go all the way to the edge? And he's made this beautiful wine. It has creamy milk chocolate, dark fruits, all these things that it says in the tasting notes. It's right. There's a very uniqueness to the aromatics. It's sometimes it's a little more lifted. And that might be the Cabernet Franc. And definitely you get that earthiness or herbal characteristic from Cabernet Franc, but you get the kind of chocolate from the Merlot. The other thing too is that the tannin structure is completely different in this wine than in the last wine. The last wine, it was a little bit blocky. The tannins here are they're silky. There's a ton of them. They sit on your palate. They really dry your palate out, but they're very, very, very fine. So that's an interesting thing, style, and they're mouth filling, like you can feel them everywhere, but they lift pretty quick. They don't like stick around, maybe like a super tannic, Italian wine or something. So a very interesting wine. I thought, a wine that is unique and different, and again, not super expensive. And I got a question about like, are any wines made only in oak, and small batch? And does it allow for enough control during fermentation? So, good question. There are more and more people making wine in small oak, and they feel like the oak itself integrates better with the wine when you make the wine in the oak. It's kind of, it's a mix and match thing. Most major high quality wines are still made in oak. I'm sorry, in stainless, or a bigger vessel, or a bigger oak, and then maybe finished in smaller oak. But there's more and more of that happening, and you're right, that is harder to control the process, because when you are in a stainless steel, or sometimes in these bigger oak barrels, a lot of times there's temperature control. But when you're in a small oak barrel, there's really no temperature control. It's just the control of the fermentation process, and the fact that you're not in a huge vessel, so the fermentation doesn't get too warm. It depends on the winery. So sometimes, people don't want to go down that path. They would rather have all the control of the temperature, because a lot of these wines are like fermented up to 90 degrees, and you're not going to get to 90 degrees in an oak barrel. So I'd have to say that there are examples of that, but it's usually a small component of the total whole, to add some complexity and depth. So again, a great question. I like these winemaking questions. One time I'll have to bring a winemaker on so he can, or she can, give us even more details. Okay, so that's that wine. Beautiful little wine. Again, a food pairing with this wine, I feel like that herbal characteristic just says lamb to me. Like, if you and I suppose if you don't like lamb, then maybe you just go get duck, or like a steak of some sort. But every time you get that, when you get that herbal characteristic and you get those tannins, it's just, it's time for lamb. Okay, so I think this wine, which is, where did I put it? Oh, so over here. Oh, look at that. I didn't even open it. So I'll talk about while I'm opening it. So this is the Bogle Essential Red. And so I picked this wine. This is the most value-oriented wine that we're tasting today. But honestly, I think every year it completely over-delivers. And it's not, they don't tell us what the grape varietals are in the wine, but my guess is that actually it does say on the back of this one, Petite Syrah, an old vine, Cabernet. So I guess maybe every year they keep it secret, and then they tell you on the back. So I couldn't find the grape varietals for some reason. But anyway, so again, it's with Petite Syrah. This is kind of a little bit more of that kitchen sink blend I was talking about. So you get this, you're going to get this really fruity characteristic from the wine. Again, every year it's like 91 points in Wine Spectator, Wine Enthusiast. It's gotten so many Best Buys. It's hard to keep track. And then the wine also has a good amount of oak use on it for its quality. We talked about how for some wines oak is very expensive, and a lot of the really inexpensive wines are aged. Some of them are aged in tank. This wine is mainly aged in oak with some in tank, but it's it's amazing to see that a wine that's sometimes under the shelf for 11, sometimes under $10, depending on what's on sale or not, sees this much oak. When you go to Bogle and you see all of the oak that's being used, it's almost mind-boggling that they can charge that little for the wine. And again, this is that really fruity kind of kitchen sink blend with that Petite Syrah. And it just says California on it, but a lot of these are kind of that area in. There's some grapes that are sourced from Clarksburg and Lodi, and then if you go up to the Dunnigan Hills, which is north of Sacramento, it's kind of almost directly east of Napa. It's where the old R.H. Phillips used to be. There's some vineyard sites out there, so they source from all over the place. So they're picking up some pretty good grapes. I mean, they're not buying from Stag's Leap District Napa, because then this wine would never be affordable. But they're finding some great grape sources within the region that's pretty close to their location in Clarksburg. So, Lodi kind of area. And again, this is really just a fascinating wine. What I love about it is this has the fruit, but then the backbone of it too. And it's got that really juicy mouthfeel. And so I like this wine with, there's a great cheese, San Joaquin Gold, and the saltiness of the cheese is kind of a really nice combination with the fruitiness of this wine. So you get this nice salty hard cheese that goes well with this wine. So good, great value wine for, everyday consumption. So, okay. So another wine that was like a little bit of it is kind of a kitchen sink blend. So this one, I couldn't find the grape varietals on it either. So everyone's getting like proprietary with their vineyard source or with their grape varietals. But I think you can kind of break down the wine and get to the grapes in it. So it's mostly sourced from it's the Josh Legacy Red Blend, before I forget. So again, producer really well respected. They make they make high end Cabernet, and this is kind of their value wine. It's one of the best selling wines in the country right now because the quality is quite good for the price. And it's sourced from different vineyard sites all over California, mostly Central Coast, Lodi, some in Sonoma and Napa. It's another one of these, like, there's a lot of new oak, or not new oak, but a lot of older oak used, and also a little bit of tank. I'm guessing some micro oxygenation. This wine, it was hard to figure out where it was from. I saw some notes, and I think that if you smell the wine, there's two things that come out of this wine that I think you can kind of break down what the varietals are. The first is the really, really forward raspberry characteristic. And so you get this, like, this character of that bright raspberry, and to me what that says, and a little bit of spice along with the bright raspberry, what that to me just says, there's got to be Zinfandel in this wine. And then when you taste the wine, it kind of has a silky finish to it with a little bit of milk chocolate, and so it has some Merlot in it. So my guess is it's Zinfandel Merlot. There was a reference that somewhere at some point this wine was made from Zinfandel Merlot, and I'm not sure what the other wines are, but there is something in there with a kick, maybe Petit Syrah, some tannins at the back of the palate. It's a little bit sweeter style wine. It has a kind of a little punch of sweetness, fruit extract for sure on the palate. And so to me, this wine is like if you have something that's sweet, like a barbecue pork ribs, this would be a perfect combination for that, right? You're taking that kind of sweetness from the wine and you're pairing it with something that's got some sweetness to it, along with some barbecue flavor too, right? Some roasted character. I think that would be a good combination with this wine. I have a question about, are most red blends not aging wines? So I would say, well, it's a lot of the red blends on the shelf in the store are not, but some of the biggest, the highest quality wines in the world are red blends. So you have wines like Opus One that is technically a red blend, right? They don't tell you if it's Cabernet. I mean, it's got a lot of Cabernet in it, I'm sure, and then other things. But or Chateau Margaux, for example, or from Bordeaux. I mean, Haut-Brion or Bordeaux blends. Let's see. So like Chateau Leneurth from Chateauneuf de Pape, which is a red blend. So there are some absolutely amazing wines. I mean, there's these proprietary reds. You see, Plump Jack or whatever from Napa too. I mean, so you have these really high end red blends, and then you have kind of the entry level, like the essential red that Bogle makes, and then this Josh, which isn't too much more expensive than the Bogle. Both very nice wines, but very fruity and forward drinking. And then, I mean, I think the first two that we tasted, the Intrinsic and the Côte du Rhône, they have a lot of tannin structure to them, and they're not as fruity, and they could benefit with a little bit of age to develop these tertiary characters. So it's kind of a difficult question to ask, but it's a really good question. I think you're just, when you buy a wine, if you're going to most of the wines that are red blends that you're going to pay 40 or 50 or $60 for should be able to age for a little bit of time at least. So hopefully that answers that question. It's hard to say, but yes, if you're buying Apothic or this Bogle Essential Red or the Josh, it's probably ready to drink tomorrow. So, okay. All right, and then the last red wine really is again another one of these cool kitchen sink blends. It is the Pessimist by Dow. So Dow is a great producer in Paso Robles. And this is kind of the Paso Robles map. They are, kind of up on the west side of Paso, so they're closer to the ocean. So they're able to make these wines that are a little bit more elegant and not as powerful as say some other producers, which actually is not a negative. I don't mean that in a negative way, right? I mean that in a, hey, these wines have kind of a little bit more acidity, a little bit more ability to age. This is probably the exception in their portfolio here. This is a very bold red blend wine called the Pessimist. It's again, it's fermented in stainless steel. It's aged a lot in new oak. It sells, upper 20s, depends on where you are. It's kind of the prices all over the place, but it's not an inexpensive red blend, but it's definitely a fruity forward style red blend. And it has, Petit Syrah, Syrah, and Zinfandel. So we didn't talk about Petit Syrah, but Petit Syrah is related to Syrah, and it's called Petit Syrah because the grape varietals are even smaller than Syrah, and so it creates this really dense, fruity wine. Not always the most interesting wine on its own, but blended with Syrah and Zinfandel, it's very interesting. And Lagrein is a grape varietal from Italy, of all things. And my guess is that they used it in this wine to kind of add some tannin structure, since it's a pretty tannic wine. I always thought this was a really fun, wine that that people a lot of folks don't know what it is, right? It sits on the shelf. It's a kitchen sink red blend. So it's always a fun one to introduce people to because I think the quality is quite good. They use a lot of new oak on this wine. And you can see really like if you want it on this one, or if you see on this one, you really do get that Petit Syrah and the Syrah, the forward fruity blueberry characteristics. This was like the longest tasting note I've ever seen from a winery. It actually went another paragraph. But I think that, I'm not sure I would give them, I would say whoever was writing this note got a little carried away, but I would underline the blueberry. I would underline the plum. I think that there's a touch of like maybe black pepper and I don't, honestly, I don't know what tamarind spice is, but I'm sure somebody out there does. But again, that by combining all these wines together, you can get a lot of different complexity. And then the one piece that I do get to this, which is nice, is you have all that fruit and the fruit's everywhere and it's in your face and it's saying, I'm very fruity. But then there's a nice balance of oak to the wine that adds a complexity of baking spice and vanilla. And that kind of balances back against the intense fruitiness. And the other thing about this wine is that there is actually a decent amount of acidity, so it does bite a little bit on the palate, which is good because this wine is like I don't know if it's 15% alcohol, but 15.2% alcohol, but it doesn't come off that way because the acidity kind of balances that wine so it doesn't taste overly alcoholic. In fact, it's quite delicious and fun to drink. And I have it drink on its own. I mean, there was probably 5 different food pairings, but honestly, this wine is just like, oh yeah, this is great. This is one of those cocktail wines, right? You just, hey, I don't have to think about this. I can just drink this. You don't have to worry about all the different amazing pairings you're gonna have to make with this wine. I did get a question about, do winemakers try to blend the wine to taste similar, same bottle year to year? Okay, so that is a great question. Again, very good question. So that is one of the advantages of red blends. It's somewhat similar to like a champagne where you have different vintages you can blend together to make a similar wine. And I would say yes. So most of my experience dealing with winemakers and tasting wines is that year in and year out, red blends generally taste pretty consistent. And so one of the reasons for that is that you could dial back certain grape varietals if they're earthier in a year that's, say, cooler, or you could dial back a wine that got too ripe. Like if you have a Grenache that got too high in ripeness and too much alcohol, you could, maybe bulk out some of that juice, not use it in the blend, and then put more Syrah in the wine, and then that would, the Syrah gets riper, but it doesn't get to the same alcohol level, so it balances back the wine. So that is a good question. A lot of this is about year in and year out making the small adjustments, and it's interesting because having blended some red wines, for some of the wines that we have in store. One of the things that's really interesting to make sure you're doing is that some of these components can really change the style of the wine. So that's where the talent of the winemaker comes in, is they got to know, because if you move the Petite Syrah 2 to 3% more, it will significantly change the way the wine tastes. And so this may be, in that sense, that's where you're talented year in, year out. You're saying, okay, well, I got to move the Petite Syrah a little bit this year to get a little bit more fruitiness, but it's got to be, but I can't move it too much. Otherwise, it won't taste what it tasted last year. So that's a great question. I think probably consistency wise, you're going to have better luck with a red blend if you're worried about vintage to vintage, or if maybe it's not the greatest vintage, like a 2011, which was a very tough vintage. You might be better off buying a red blend instead of a straight Cabernet or a straight Merlot, because there's definitely more flexibility in the grape varietals to make that wine work. Okay. So those were some great questions. So I got to the end here. I don't know if there's any other questions. You can put them in the chat. If there aren't, I don't see any more coming in. Let me see. Somebody says, so that's a question about, certain types of wines that you can't find anymore. Sometimes wines move on, like the Exponential. Unfortunately, that wine's not made anymore. So, but if you're new to the red blend scene, my suggestion would be that you look at a wine like a Apothic or whatnot, and those wines have a touch of sweetness to them, and then you can make the next steps to the Josh, and then the next step beyond that is the Intrinsic, and then the Pessimist. So these are kind of like steps you can take to see kind of, to find your wine. It's there. I would say what the challenge with the red blend category is that, because a lot of times it doesn't say what type of style the wine is, it can be challenging to figure out what's in the wine. And that's why I think sometimes the wines end up, they end up lost on a shelf. So Exponential is a good example. End up lost on the shelf, and so that it's not being made anymore. But as we hope to define these better in store, we'll be a little bit clearer about, this is a Bordeaux style, or this is a kitchen sink blend, or whatnot, or this is a Rhone style blend, to help you understand what you're drinking, and then that'll help you understand, kind of what steps to take as you kind of explore red blends. There's a couple questions. Why did you choose the particular order of the wines? I did it because I did it by kind of the fruity characteristic of the wines. I tried to go from least fruity to most fruity. So because I felt like if I went most fruity, if I started with like the Pessimist, it would overpower the rest of the wines. So that's the direction I did. I'm not always right. I'm a master of wine, but I'm often wrong. So I probably would have put the Intrinsic a little later because of the tannins. But I think that really, when you're thinking about tasting wines, you want to think about, oh, how am I going to taste the subtleties in the wines? And then as it gets more and more powerful, let's not have those subtleties get overpowered. So that was generally what I was saying. I would have, Intrinsic could have moved, I think. And then there was a question, if are there words I should look for if I like dry, not sweet red blends? Okay, so this is a really good question. So there are quite a few red blends out there that are under $10, that there's a significant amount of sweetness in the wine. And you might ask, well, why is that? And that sweetness helps to cover up some of the tannins that can get a little aggressive in red blends, right? So I would suggest to you, if you like really dry red blends, I would try first thing you could do is you could try a red blend from Australia. The Australian ones are very, very dry. So a GSM red blend would be a very dry Australian red wine. You can also try like the Southern Rhone. This Côte de Rhone is a very dry wine. There's no residual sugar in it at all. And then you can also try like something like a Bordeaux. Bordeaux makes some, I mean, most of the wines are very, very dry, and some of them are very expensive. You can get a $12 Bordeaux. It's very dry. And so, you know, if you don't like sweet, or you don't like a touch of sweetness, so these wines aren't like sweet, but they do have, you know, a little bit of finished kind of sugar on the finish on a couple of them. That's where I would go. And so what are some of the red blend pairing recommendations for spicy Indian food? Good question. So now you're really challenging my knowledge of red blend. So I'd say in most cases with spicy Indian food, red wines are going to be very tough because the tannins take the spice and enhance it. It's like putting fire on fire, which is really tough. There are a couple of southern like Rhone wine, or basically Languedoc wines, that don't have a tremendous amount of tannins, and they don't have a lot of alcohol, like a Chinon, which I think could be a good combination. It's gonna be kind of hard to find them. That might be the one I would suggest. I'm trying to think of any other types of red blends. My suggestion with Indian food would be really, if it's spicy, would be, you know, to get a Riesling with a touch of residual sugar in it. That's a perfect combination. Sometimes Sauvignon Blanc, like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, can be a good combination. That would probably be safer because sometimes the wines can get, you know, you can ruin a good dish of food with the wrong wine combination on that one. Okay. I think that, you know, there are a couple other questions, but we're really pretty much at time. The one question is will we be doing more of these? And that I will answer. And absolutely yes. So we're going to do one of these almost every month. Not exactly every month, but we're going to publish them out. Look for them in the store. We're sending out emails to tell everybody that's what's happening. The goal here is just so that we can help everyone understand what's on our shelves, right? I mean, we've got a million different wines, and a lot of them are different and interesting, and sometimes they just sit there and everyone's like, well, what does this mean? Or what is this wine? And so that's what we're doing. We're introducing all these wines so that we can help you find new and interesting wines. So I just want, you know, last thing I want to do is just say, hey, thanks to everybody. There's a lot of great stores that we sell wines in, and there's a lot of great websites that we have that you know, we thanks to co-brand. You know, we partner with the Napa Valley Wine Academy, you know, on our education. And there's, you know, a lot of great maps that were delivered by things like Discover California Wines or PasoWines.com or WashingtonWines.org. And if you want to learn more about those, I definitely encourage you to go to them. All right. With that, I'm going to end my presentation, and we will all see you again, hopefully at the next virtual tasting.